Good afternoon to everybody here at America House, and also to those of you around the world joining us online today. My name is Volker Depkat. I'm a trained historian and a professor of American Studies at the University of Regensburg. And I'm also a member of the board of the BAA, and in this capacity that I am chairing this second keynote of our conference here today, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this event. The second keynote of our conference will be given by Professor Paul Apostolidis. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Welcome to Munich. It's a great honor also to have you with us here this afternoon. Professor Apostolidis comes to us from the London School of Economics, where he serves as a professor of government, a professor and school academic lead for civic engagement at the Department of Government. This professorship emphasizes leadership to enrich undergraduate education with an emphasis on civic engagement and public-oriented research. Professor Apostolidis holds a bachelor's degree in politics from Princeton University, and he received his PhD in government from Cornell University in 1996. From Cornell University, he moved on to teach at Whitman College, where he held the T. Paul Chair of Political Science from 1997 to 2019. And then in 2019, he joined the London School of Economics and Political Science, and he has been working there ever since. In his earlier research, Professor Apostolidis analyzed the cultural politics of the US Christian right through a critical approach derived from Theodor Adorno, and he wrote extensively in cultural studies, including issues of gender, sexuality, and power. And in his later and current work, he places critical social theory in dialogue with Latinx migrant laborers' work experiences, political organizations, and languages of collective action. From his fieldwork with Latinx migrant workers' organizations and communities in the Western United States, he strives to derive insights for critiques of capitalism and racial domination, and to explore prospects for deeper democracy and social solidarity. Characteristically, his research seeks to reflect his empirical work through the theoretical lens of diverse 20th and 21st century thinkers such as Antonio Gramsci, Michel Foucault, Kathy Weeks, Judith Butler, and others. Professor Apostolidis is the author of 3 books: The Fight for Time, Migrant Day Laborers and the Politics of Precarity, published with Oxford University Press in 2019. Another book, Breaks in the Chain, What Immigrant Workers Can Teach America About Democracy, published in 2010 with the University of Minnesota Press. And Stations of the Cross, Adorno and the Christian Right Radio, Duke University Press, 2000. He also co-edited the volume Public Affairs, Politics in the Age of Sex Scandals, also published with Duke University in 2004. In addition, he is on the editorial boards of the journals Political Theory and Emancipations. He co-edits the book series Studies in Subaltern Latino Politics for Oxford University Press. He is affiliated with the London Schools of Economics Phelan United States Center, and he is a director of the Radical Critical Theory Circle. His 2 most recent publications are 2 articles that came out last year, one in the European Journal of Political Theory, which was a critical reinterpretation of Marx's Working Day chapter in Capital, Volume 1. In this article, he emphasizes the significance of social reproduction. The other article that came out in 2023 for New Media and Society, a study of UK digital platform-based micro-workers, motivations for performing this low-wage and personally taxing form of labor. He's currently writing a book titled Night Work and the Politics of Freedom, which is on nighttime labor, social reproduction, and working class politics. And again, he is combining empirical studies of key contemporary industries with critical theory on race, gender, and capitalism. And the project is currently under review by Oxford University Press. His talk today will be about different kinds of courage, Mexican and Greek immigration narratives. And just in case that you wondered how anybody could bring Greeks and Mexicans together, the answer is oral history and family history. And with this, I hand over to you, Professor Apostolidis. Good to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Volker, for that exhaustive, not to say exhausting introduction. I have nothing left to say. Well, I think we'd better start by, addressing the elephant in the room, which is that everywhere I go, people say, has anyone ever told you you look exactly like Stanley Tucci? My students, people randomly walking down the street that I run into in London, the waiter at the Vietnamese restaurant today for lunch, I think he wanted an autograph. So I just wanted to say, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but this is not a surprise celebrity appearance by Stanley Tucci to talk about the Italian immigrant experience and Italian cuisine. It's just me that you get today. So. No, seriously, though. No, it's really a great pleasure, and it's an honor to be here speaking with you all. Thanks for coming. Thanks to Christoph for your amazing work to organize everything and for the invitation. So I'm going to try something this evening that I've never done before when speaking at an academic event. So thanks in advance for participating in this experiment with no prior consultation and without having given your consent. I'm going to draw on an essay that I published earlier this year in New Lines magazine to speak about intersections and frictions between the immigration narratives of communities in the US that originate from two different places, Mexico and Greece. And in doing this, I'm going to bring together elements of my research with Mexican migrant workers, comments about the histories of Greek and Mexican immigration to the United States, and reflections on my own family's stories of coming to the US from Greece about a century ago. I think I like the idea of trying to do this at our conference on the theme of narratives about immigration, and I hope you do too. And I think that this actually also makes for some interesting connections, both to the keynote yesterday and the one that will follow tomorrow, because Karen mentioned her own family's history when she was talking about her work, her historical work. I'm also going to speak a little bit about children's experiences of immigration, which connects to some of Carmen's themes, or Carmen's main theme tomorrow. So as Volker mentioned, the work that I do, it's a form of grounded political theory, which combines critical theory with empirical investigations in working class communities, often including my own political involvement with Latino migrant workers organizations in the US. By pursuing this approach to critical theory, which is rather unconventional but is actually gaining some interest in my field, I aim to generate insights into the operations of capital and race, while also shedding light on prospects for political activation among working class groups. But I want to do something different today by interspersing elements of personal memoir among the stories that I tell about biopolitical power and counter-hegemonic resistance among migrants who are currently targeted by the political right for abuse, incarceration, and expulsion. If all this works as I'm hoping, then I think you should come away from this talk with three things to think about. So first of all, an idea of how juxtaposing migration stories that are both starkly dissimilar but mutually resonant might help unsettle increasingly brittle and dangerous anti-migrant hostilities in the United States, notably among groups that have migrant pasts of their own. Second, I hope to give you at least one model of how we as academics can experiment with our typical forms of speaking and listening professionally, right? Reflecting on the entanglements of our personal stories with material that we gather through our research. And then third, I'll relate the exercise of pairing and comparing Greek and Mexican migration narratives to the dialogue that my research fosters between migrant stories and a critical theoretical account of racial capitalist power in ways inspired by Foucault and Gramsci. In 1916, a teenage immigrant from the island of Lesbos in Greece climbed off a transatlantic ship and presented himself to the US border authorities in Boston. He had traveled by himself, leaving his parents and sisters behind as violence between Greeks and Turks escalated in his homeland. The boy was my maternal grandfather. Our family legend, which is always told with a grin of pride at my papu's audacity, is that although he was only 14, he convinced the guards that he was 16 and thus legally able to enter the United States on his own. In later years, doubt lingered about how old Papu exactly was when he came. He had brought no documents attesting to his date or place of birth, and none were required of him. Well, this story tugs at me today as inhibitions against the most extreme anti-immigrant rhetoric in America seem to evaporate. You might recall that at a campaign rally last December, Donald Trump evoked the ominous specter of migrants, quote, poisoning the blood of our country. Such rhetoric, which reiterates Hitlerian racial motifs, cannot be dismissed as just an improvisational flourish, notwithstanding Trump's well-known penchant for speaking off the cuff. Trump has announced plans, if elected, quote, to round up undocumented people already in the U.S. on a vast scale and detain them in sprawling camps while they wait to be expelled, as the New York Times reported. But I think even more telling was the way that Republican representative, U.S. Representative Nicole Maliotakis of New York's 11th Congressional District defended Trump's comment about preserving the purity of America's blood. So she was speaking on CNN, and Maliotakis proudly invoked her own Greek and Cuban family history, saying, "My parents are immigrants. I have an immigrant history too." She did this to authorize her own claims that immigrants were, quote, poisoning America with fentanyl, and, quote, destroying New York City with crime. And she insisted that Trump was just naming this ugly reality. But Maliotakis' reference to her family background added another ingredient, because it signaled that behind Trump's remark lay a core distinction between historical and geographical immigrant cohorts that CNN watchers needed to appreciate. The Congresswoman's website differentiates between two groups of immigrants, as Democrats and Republicans alike commonly do. There are legal immigrants, quote unquote, like her parents, and her immigrant constituents, who the census says are basically not from Latin America, and whom she says just want to achieve the American dream. And then there are the illegal border crossers, who allegedly spread criminality and disease in the U.S. And create, quote, a problem at the border, as Democratic U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer euphemized. He said this when he was asked about Trump's statement about poisoning the blood, in this way, I think, markedly qualifying his condemnation of it. No one in our family or the Philadelphia Greek-American community where my papu became a revered leader would have called him an illegal alien or an illegal immigrant. Yet that's exactly what he was. And unfortunately, Representative Maliotakis is not an outlier. Despite our own immigrant past, many Greek Americans, along with other white ethnic groups from earlier waves of immigration, are either partisans of the Trump-led GOP or migrant-wary Democrats. What does it take for people who hold precious historical ties of culture and place, like many Greek Americans, to gain a sense of shared fate and common experience with others whom they consider foreign or maybe even alien threats, like Mexican immigrants at whom so much vitriol is directed today? And how might it be possible to do this while still acknowledging the key differences between groups' historical experiences, distinct types and magnitudes of obstacles, and varying forms of courage needed to overcome them? Is there a way that recognizing rough but imperfect parallels between distinct migrant pathways might help people approach the divergences with more nuance and understanding? Well, these questions have obviously perplexed people for a long time, since at least the rise of modern nationalism, but they feel acutely urgent today, and not only in America's knife-edge political milieu, but also in post-Brexit Britain, where I live now, and countless other societies, including the many European countries where anti-migrant parties of the right are gaining power. I've been mulling over these issues since I began doing research with Mexican immigrants some 25 years ago. And as I have learned over the years about Latino migration histories through my research, the stories and the sense experiences that I've imbibed as myself the product of Greek migrants have continually recurred to me. It's very easy to overstate both the similarities and the disparities when comparing the fates of different migrant groups, especially given the thorny issues of race that entangle modern immigration. But I want to argue that it is also politically indispensable to venture such comparisons, fraught as they may be, especially right now. And I want to illustrate how this can work by placing my family's Greek immigrant stories side by side with stories told to me by Mexican migrants who waged a formidable, if fleeting, union battle against one of the world's biggest meat producers, Tyson Foods. So in the summer of 1999, the New York Times and the Washington Post reported that the largest wildcat or illegal strike in recent U.S. history had just broken out at a massive slaughterhouse and beef processing factory owned by a company called Iowa Beef Processors, IBP. And this had happened near the small town of Pasco in eastern Washington state in the Pacific Northwest. Fed up with horrifyingly dangerous conditions and defying their own union's unresponsive leadership, nearly 1,500 workers stormed out of the factory. Whole families camped outside the gates for 6 sweltering weeks amid the stench of cattle feedlots. Almost all the workers were Mexican immigrants, and eventually they wrested control of their local union from white leaders who had been collaborating with the company in ignoring workers' injuries and health problems and generally treating workers with extreme disrespect, even abuse. The reformers then democratized their union, which was called Teamsters Local 556, opening up many more union offices to elections and encouraging active attendance at and participation in much more frequent union meetings. They then launched a sustained attack on the company's deplorable labor practices, and for years they succeeded in mitigating the company's worst behaviors. But Tyson acquired IVP in 2001, and in short order, this much bigger company initiated a campaign to have the union abolished. In 2005, the union lost a decertification election into which Tyson had poured its vast corporate assets. And yet that was only after an unprecedented battle with workers who had acquired startling resources of personal resolve and collective determination along the migrant trail. So these events occurred just about 30 miles away from Whitman College, an undergraduate institution in Walla Walla, Washington, where I was on the faculty and on the hunt for a new research project. Tyson's global economic power, the media's interest, the bravery of the workers' revolt, all these things piqued my curiosity, but so did the flicker of something that was a little bit more personal. This was a struggle waged by immigrants, and I wondered, what did these people's experiences as immigrants have to do with their bold actions as workers? And were my family's stories and histories at all like theirs, even though we were Greek and they were Mexican? So I began interviewing Tyson workers to gather oral histories as primary material for a book, which I published in 2010, as Volker mentioned. The book Breaks in the Chain. And this book argues that exploring the self-narrated migration and work experiences of Mexican people in America, in America's food industry, that this reveals how racial biopolitics operates in the U.S. and how to challenge it. I ground a critique of Foucault's conception of biopolitics in a Gramscian analysis of migrant meatpacking workers' common sense about the forms of power and domination to which they had been subjected and about their own capacities to fight back. I approach these workers' personal life narratives as articulations of such common sense, heeding Gramsci's exhortation to listen closely for elements of social critique that are embedded in these stories and to attend to their philosophical and political potential. I'll say more about these ideas in the arguments later on, but first I want to tell you how the experience of soliciting these Mexican migrants' life histories affected me as someone from a family with a treasured migration story of our own. So in the interviews, the workers recalled their childhood years growing up in rural or urban Mexico. They came from all over the country. They explained how they had decided to leave for the United States and how it felt to leave behind people and places that they loved or maybe didn't love so much. They described harrowing, sometimes life-threatening treks across the U.S.-Mexico border, even in the 1980s, before the border became as intensively militarized as it is today. They talked about then working in the fields after they arrived in the United States, picking apples, strawberries, grapes, asparagus, every kind of crop. And then they told chilling stories of working at Tyson, where they quickly realized that enduring constant bodily pain and routine humiliation were just basic conditions of their everyday labor. And they shared how they had emboldened each other to stand up for themselves when they were mistreated and take charge of the local union so that it would support rather than thwart their efforts. Well, one day my assistant and I interviewed a woman named Elvira Mendez at her kitchen table. Elvira had worked at Tyson IBP for a long time, and she had helped lead the push for democratic reforms through the union. And as we talked about her memories of the past and present struggles, now and then one of her grandkids would come running into the room. She would pause to hand out a cookie or dry someone's tears. When we were finished, I was delighted that she insisted that we stay for a bowl of pozole. Now, pozole is a delicious Mexican stew made with corn, hominy, and either chicken or pork, usually served with fresh wedges of lime, as well as some dried oregano and chile. I had not tasted pozole before I had moved to this heavily Mexican region of Washington State. But something felt very familiar as I was talking with Elvira and watching her through the steam of the pozole and seeing the way that she acted with children and with food. She reminded me of my grandmother. Even the lime in the dish brought to mind the lemon wedges that my yaya, which is Greek for grandmother, sorry for the American pronunciation there, always had on the table. And sometime soon afterwards, then I was catching up with the union's leader, Maria Martinez, about the interviews. And something happened in the midst of our conversation that I've always remembered. So in a moment of rather hasty self-disclosure, I just kind of blurted out, you know, I love these conversations, Maria, because the workers remind me so much of people in my family. I think there have got to be real similarities between Greek and Mexican immigration stories. She looked me in the eye and without hesitating or smiling responded, no, Paul, it's different. It's not the same. It's really different. Now, one of Maria's virtues as a leader was her willingness to speak directly about controversial matters. She had rebuffed me briskly and I felt stung. But later I began to see that what I think she needed me to grasp if I was going to be of any use to the workers' cause, as I really hoped to be through my research and my teaching and my community activism. She was warning me that if I didn't recognize what was different about Mexican immigrant pathways today from the migrant passages of my ancestors, I simply wouldn't understand what the struggle at Tyson was all about. This bracing lesson, however, didn't stop the flow of parallel images in my brain. And I think that there is something worth holding on to in that impulse to see one group's migrant experiences reflected in those of another, so long as this doesn't prevent us from attending to what's really different. So with that in mind, let's consider, how does my family story compare to those related by the migrants that I met in the midst of the struggle against Tyson? Well, the central character in our family's narrative has always been my papu, Nicholas Pattis. So Papu was born in a village near Mytilene on Lesbos. And according to an anecdote in a family cookbook created by my cousin, Poppy Gregory, when Papu, quote, was a little boy, he drank his milk straight from their mother goat. He would just get under her and suckle. He grew up to be a doctor and certainly always looked well-fed. You can tell. Now, Poppy makes it sound like it was no big deal for Papu to go from being an island child whose family kept a few goats to being a doctor. And yet a lot of hardship and loss and struggle intervened for this individual whose life began in a village at the turn of the 20th century and ended in 1982 with his portrait hanging in the physician's library of Philadelphia's Lankenau Hospital, where he was a distinguished staff member. Things changed for the worse for Papu's family when he was a kid and when tensions escalated between Greeks and Turks just before World War I. This was still several years before the burning in 1922 of Smyrna by Turkish forces, which drove hundreds of thousands of Greeks and many Armenians into exile. and well before the 1923 official Greek-Turkish population exchange. And yet, a process of ethnic cleansing, triggering mass population movements and refugee flows, was already well underway, flushing Greek-speaking Christians out of what would become the Turkish Republic's territory and ejecting Turkish-speaking Muslims from lands over which Greece was assuming authority, including many Aegean islands. My older family members' memories are hazy on the details, although mercifully free, and I'm not sure why, of the tendency to demonize Turks that often features in Greek remembrances of this era. But essentially, amid growing civil disturbances and violent episodes, and as ethnic nationalist fervor mounted and the Ottoman Empire contracted, Papou's family found it necessary to abandon Lesbos. It was then decided that Papou would travel all by himself to America, even though he was only 14. Somehow, he made it to Boston, where his famous encounter with the U.S. immigration control took place. They evidently let him in without documents, but they did assert their prerogative in another way that was quite typical at the time. They shortened his surname from Padiatis to Padis, as if to say, in you come, but we decide how you'll be heard and seen here in America, so we're giving you a more normal name. Well, Papou could be very persuasive, as this tale of his arrival illustrates. So he became interested in American politics. You see, I come by it naturally. 22 years later, he was determined to go see President Franklin D. Roosevelt speak at the 1936 Democratic National Convention, which was in Philadelphia. He had no connection to the party, no credentials, and no ID, no ticket. But nevertheless, Papou presented himself at the door as Dr. Pattis, full of gravitas, probably sporting his signature bow tie. And he was escorted to a front row seat with no questions asked. I know this because he filmed the thing on a Super 8 camera. Courage, audacity, tenacity. Those are the personal qualities that I've always heard associated with my grandfather and his immigration story. And also, as in so many immigrant stories, unrelenting hard work. So Papou started working 2 jobs when he got to Boston, laboring by day in a tire factory and at night as a waiter in a restaurant that was frequented by Calvin Coolidge, who was fond of being served by Nick, the young Greek waiter. In little time, and still as a teenager, Papou made enough money to pay for his parents and sisters to come join him in the United States, and he even earned enough to set his own father up with a shoe repair shop in Boston. A few years later, he was awarded a scholarship to attend Boston University. Then he attended medical school and launched his career as a physician in Philadelphia. More than an inspiring professional, he also had a zest for strengthening the community. He and my grandmother co-founded a civic organization in 1936 called the Hellenic University Club, which encouraged young Greek Americans to go to university and gave them financial support for doing that, and it still thrives today. And then when a new suburban Greek Orthodox church opened its doors in 1960, it was Papou who flourished the honorary key. Now, I know nothing about what my Papou's voyage to America was like, but I do know that when the family became uprooted, in the years just before he left Greece, things were dangerous. Right? Resting on the mantelpiece of our flat in London is a cherished object that survived that period. It's our family icon. It was painted several hundred years ago in traditional Greek Orthodox style with gold leaf that shimmers beautifully in candlelight. And it's big. It's about the size of a poster. It shows St. Simeon's joyful response as the baby Jesus as presented at the temple. After briefly moving to what is now the Turkish mainland, the family ended up being force-marched back to Lesbos. Papou's parents worried about how to keep the icon safe from people who might steal it or destroy it along the way. So the story is that they wrapped it in a blanket, put it on Papou's young shoulders, and told nosy fellow travelers that it was a mirror. This promptly earned them mockery and derision. How vain those Padiatises are. Here we are fleeing our houses, taking with us only what we can carry, and they care so much about their precious good looks. What gets hidden? What goes into hiding when people immigrate to the United States? For us, it was an inconvenient syllable in a long Greek name, in a culture that favors names like Smith and Brown. It was my papu's age and status as a child, and in a way, it was his childhood itself. It was an old family icon, later to shine forth in all its somber beauty, but battered by the years and the miles. And it was also, I learned to my astonishment, when I was about 30 years old, my parents hushed up a legal marriage at a New York City courthouse, 6 months before their official 1960 wedding at the main Greek Orthodox Church in central Philadelphia. You see, my father was a Greek immigrant from Alexandria, Egypt, who came in the 50s, whereas my mother was born in Philadelphia to Greek immigrant parents. And it seems that about the time my father met my mother, his visa was running out, and U.S. immigration law, based then on national origin quotas, skewed to favor Northern Europeans, made it difficult for Greeks to become permanent residents. Well, the Mexican people who I interviewed in Pasco shared their own stories of things being hidden and going into hiding when they came to America. The theme resonated, but the details were significantly different, and they speak to the frankly greater courage, audacity, and tenacity needed at moments when hiding things meant survival. There was the money to pay for a family's cross-border passage that a mother sewed into the hem of her skirt to conceal it from the coyotes who brought them over. There was precious food and water revealed and shared when families were cooped up in way stations with only dirty water to drink and no idea often which side of the border they were even on. Mostly the stories were of people having to hide themselves from fearsome danger, often showing great mettle, generosity, and clever resourcefulness. The one young man named Pedro Ruiz told me how for part of his cross-border journey, he and a fellow traveler had to be shut up inside the trunk of a car. The air was tight, the heat was intense, the car was hurtling down the highway, the road was rough, and the other man started to panic. But Pedro kept his nerve and gently calmed the other fellow, repeating, "You're going to make it. This is so you can make it." Elvira struck a similar chord when she told me about crouching inside a big crate of apples, her heart pounding as immigration officials raided a fruit packing house in central Washington state where she was working. Hours later that afternoon, she climbed out, she tossed her telltale broad-brimmed farm worker's hat in the bushes, put on lipstick, and strolled confidently out of the facility, head held high. You might say that she was hiding in plain view, and yet this act of slightly disingenuous self-assertion, in this act, she was also confirming for herself and others that she had a right to be there at that place of work and in that country. And Pedro had done something very similar during an immigration raid at a warehouse near Los Angeles, where he was working. So when the agent showed up, a coworker froze in terror and started nervously coughing. Pedro kept his cool, though, dispatched his colleague to the bathroom, and stayed at his post, acting like someone who had a serious job to do and didn't appreciate distractions. The agents never questioned him, although that day they took away 40 people. Pedro and Elvira were protecting themselves, concealing themselves, but they were also visibly asserting themselves by passing. And I see here more than a passing resemblance to the precocious teenager from Lesbos who assures the border agents that he's 2 years older than he really is and walks on into the streets of Boston. Or who makes Roosevelt's convention ushers think that it's obvious that, of course, the doctor should be shown to his seat. Yes, the divergences are immediately noticeable, but let's not rush too quickly past the correspondences. Because these rough but real parallels evoke the courage that it takes for immigrants to bend the rules and mollify their enforcers with dignity and pluck. It's a matter of having the nerve to enact the right to have rights, as Hannah Arendt puts it, precisely when the law and state tell you that those rights are not yours to claim. There are certainly ways that we Greek Americans and many others who identify with immigrant roots in earlier eras should see more than just traces of the familiar in how recent immigrants from Mexico have protected and advanced themselves. The key is that this might require being more honest with ourselves than we might prefer about not just the easy-to-celebrate heroic themes, the long hours worked, upward mobility, a passion for education. Right? That's the easy stuff. It also means facing up to the more ambivalent chapters of our own migration stories. Laws circumvented, disrespect mutely suffered, deceptive appearances fashioned under watchful eyes. But now again, what about the differences? So in my study at home in London, I have hanging on the wall a poster that I got from the National Day Labour Organizing Network, or NDLON. It has this slogan on it: courage is greater than fear. After my book about the workers of Local 556, I wrote a book about the precarious work experiences and community building efforts of day laborers who earn very, very low wages through extremely short-term jobs, mostly doing yard work and construction. The day laborer's motto, courage is greater than fear, suggests how we might further understand what's really different, to recall Maria Martinez's admonition, about Greek and Mexican immigration experiences. Because I think to see the differences, you have to ask, what exactly is there to fear when you're an immigrant, and what kind of courage do you need to face down that fear? Well, wartime conditions during a period of accelerating imperial decline made things dangerous for my great-grandparents in Papuan Greece. And I'm sure that there were plenty of other hazards on the ship across the Atlantic. And yet my ancestors did not face the everyday menace of violence from the state or private individuals when they arrived. Greeks usually didn't encounter such threats, although they were at times targeted by the early 20th century Ku Klux Klan, which considered Greeks, quote, not exactly white. They also faced mainstream racially tinged prejudices for not being from the right part of Europe or not really being from Europe at all. Right? Or it was said Greeks were not modern enough and too prone to take life easy in the blissful Mediterranean sun, as my cousin, archaeologist Dimitris Plantzos, argues in his witty critique of post-war pop cultural images of Greece. As Dimitris shows, the racializing tropes associated with Asians and Middle Easterners that Edward Said has analyzed as Orientalist devices, they've been avidly applied to Greeks too. And of course, I'll resist the urge to mention the British Museum's long assertion of its prerogative for the sake of all human civilization to keep the Elgin marbles in London, where the proper people can take care of them. But the point is that the cultural prejudice and institutional devaluation faced historically and even now by Greek immigrants and Greeks are quite different from the violent hostility and the systematic, deadly, dehumanizing domination that have confronted Mexicans who migrate north to the United States. In part, this difference relates to the Americas' entrenched, yet historically mutable, social hierarchies of skin color. Popular parlance has often described Greeks as swarthy or olive-complexioned. This proved rather inconvenient for 18th and 19th century Brits and Germans who wanted to identify Greece in all its ancient glories with the cultural heritage of those who were more likely to be fair-skinned and fair-haired. Such fantasies helped to justify colonial and imperialist rule over people with darker-hued bodies in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. And yet, although historically deemed not quite white, Greeks have now essentially been amalgamated to the bland and less freighted category of white ethnics in the United States. And this classification carries racial residues, but it does not structure whole systems of economic and political power. By contrast, Mexican-origin people today bear the legacies of skin-based colonial categorizations that were finally differentiated and methodically deployed to govern diverse areas of social life, including marriage and work. Under the rule of Spanish colonial pigmentocracy, darker skin color and other traits marking indigenous or African ancestry were explicitly invoked to assign people to a lower social status. Following the subsequent consolidation then of racial types in the 19th century, to be labeled a Mexican by whites in the US became a matter of whole cloth stigmatization. It implicitly referenced traces of indigeneity, blackness, or black proximity as defining a person or group in toto rather than by degrees. It also enlists skin color in erasing distinctions of national origin, insofar as the epithet Mexican thrown at Latino people is thrown at Latino people from places as far from one another geographically and culturally as, say, Nicaragua and Peru. And it legitimizes violence that is routine rather than episodic, as much on the open turf of national borderlands as inside the closed walls of maquiladoras or packing houses. When Pedro Ruiz finally made it to the US-Mexico border, he was shot at as he ran through the border hills. And the men wielding the guns were not US Border Patrol agents, They were armed vigilantes. The private militias that take the law into their own hands to keep Mexicans out of Arizona are tolerated by the government and lauded by Republican officials in the Southwest. When that's what one has to fear, it takes a different kind of courage to keep going, hoping, and working compared with the fortitude that my ancestors had to show. And it doesn't make the latter any less honorable to say that. The border's militarization in both its private and public aspects is now far advanced compared to what it was 30 years ago when Pedro crossed over. Today, more U.S. private citizens near the border are armed with guns. More Americans are armed with guns. And they have a stronger organizational basis for using extrajudicial violence to keep out Mexicans and Central Americans. This is a chilling new chapter in an ongoing story of racial violence in the American Southwest. Despite Republican efforts to blot out inconvenient facts from school textbooks, it is still, fortunately, common knowledge that countless black people have been lynched in various eras of U.S. history or throughout U.S. history. Yet few Americans are aware that lynching Mexicans was common practice in the Southwest, especially in Texas, in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Thousands of Mexicans were tortured and murdered in these unspeakable acts of terrorism. And while it's important to appreciate the historical differences between black and Mexican experiences of lynching, both stemmed from organized systems of violence involving cooperation between private groups and public law enforcement. Most Americans today, if you mention the Texas Rangers, they think of a baseball team. But in the history of that region, the Texas Rangers were government forces that specialized in lynching Mexicans and persecuting Mexican communities with ruthless brutality. Now, I'm not sure what would have happened to my papu if his ploy to pass as a 16-year-old at the Boston border hadn't worked. Officials at the time commonly detained unaccompanied children, people with symptoms of illness, and others deemed likely to become public charges. I do know, though, that he almost certainly would not have been locked up for more than a few days or weeks, or told to wait for an immigration court to consider his case with no access to counsel and no date given for a hearing, nor was he branded a criminal for lacking the proper documents. But all these things were precisely what Pedro Luis, Elvira Mendez, and their co-workers had to fear when they came to America, that and the legacy of the Texas Rangers. And that meant mustering quite another level of bravery and resourcefulness. Now, you saw the picture of Trump earlier in this talk. Obviously, these days, a lot of Americans would get irritated or angry listening to what I've been saying. They might retort, sure, things are really different for Mexican immigrants compared with Greeks. But that's not because Mexicans are under threat. It's because they are invading America. What choice do Arizonans have but to grab a gun when the government lets violent criminals swarm into our country with no consequences for breaking the law? What alternative but to lock people up in detention centers, whether they are adults or, let's say, 14-year-olds whose parents send them here on their own? And these are hardly fringe views, right? The once marginal rhetoric of invasion now dominates ordinary Republican talk on immigration in the party's mainstream among its main leaders and members. And these were common excuses a century ago for the lethal violence of the Texas Rangers, and they were no more valid then than they are today. A Stanford economist recently found that since 1880, immigrants have been less likely to be imprisoned than U.S.-born individuals, thus aligning with many other analyses of these kinds of issues. But, of course, the rhetoric and the violence have their uses. In the days when the Texas Rangers dispensed the state's justice, Mexican people were killed, harassed, and stereotyped to keep them in their place. That meant, usually, doing backbreaking physical labor in the fields, especially after the abolition of black slavery made farm labor harder to get for American agribusiness. The combined powers of persuasion and coercion, culture and economics, backed by military force, or hegemony in Gramsci's sense, sought to ensure that Mexicans would stay docile, although not without eliciting counter-struggles from below. Academics from prestigious universities even testified to Congress in the 1920s that Mexicans were suited to farm work by nature. Mexicans, they pronounced, had bodies made for hard labor, minds ill-equipped for intellectual tasks, and volatile temperaments needing firm discipline by their social betters. Well, Gramsci also insists that ordinary people can find kernels of transformative good sense in their own common sense, which they acquire in local communities and material experiences of work. The key, he thinks, is for leaders among the people to encourage careful thinking about how history has informed people's assumptions about their own and other groups' identities. The legacies of racial violence and the growing muscle of today's racist right wing are daunting and dispiriting. But we should not underestimate the potency of immigrant common sense, expressed through immigrant family stories about love and courage and work as strangers in America, and refined in the glow of history to foster more good sense in these disturbing times. Such good sense abounds within Mexican-American political communities, from those associated with the United Farm Workers movement to more recent upsurges among groups like Teamsters Local 556. And I wonder, can intellectual leadership ferment more good sense within the common sense of other immigrant groups, especially those that now benefit from the wages of whiteness? Papu knew about hard physical labor from that tire factory and all those nights at the restaurant as a newly arrived immigrant. Yaya's mother knew it her whole life. So her name was Anastasia Evangelidis, and we called her Big Yaya, although she was barely 5 feet tall as an elderly woman. Now, Big Yaya worked for some 30 years in a Johnson & Johnson factory in New Brunswick, New Jersey, where Yaya's family had settled when they fled Asia Minor. Big Yaya lived with Yaya and Papu, and when I went over to their house, she was always a bundle of energy. I would find her either upstairs in her room sewing clothes or downstairs in the kitchen furiously stirring a pot of something on the stove. That is, unless Papu was in there curing his olives or stewing squid with red wine and peppercorns, exuding a pungent aroma that's still right there in my olfactory memory. But one day when I was over there, Big Yaya was just tired. She was sitting quietly in the breakfast room. Her back was hurting, and her arthritis was acting up. All those years at Johnson & Johnson, Yaya told me, had made Big Yaya's muscles and joints very stiff. So I decided, I was a teenager at the time, I decided I would give Big Yaya a back rub. And I'd never done that before. She had always been the one who was patting me on the back and hoisting me up onto her knee and clucking, "My boy, my boy." She didn't really say much else that I understood, because I didn't speak Greek, and she didn't speak much English. I was utterly shocked by how knotted up her back muscles felt. They actually didn't feel like muscles at all. They felt like hard pieces of wood. And I remember her face scrunching up as I tried in vain to get those sinews to soften. Some 20 years later, I am sitting with Elvira at her kitchen table, and she is telling me how working on the line at Tyson Foods has affected her body. Now, meatpacking has long been one of America's most dangerous jobs. So when I did my research in Pasco, Washington, Tyson's plant there was in the worst quartile of American meatpacking facilities for workplace injuries and health problems. You know that each year, 1 out of every 4 workers at that plant became so seriously injured or ill from their job that the company let them miss a day off of work. That's according to Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration data, which almost certainly and vastly undercount the rate of injuries. Now, among the most common injuries in meatpacking are musculoskeletal disorders that cause workers' muscles and joints to swell or to lock up and to constantly be in pain. This happens from making repetitive motions at frantically high speeds, minute by minute, hour upon hour, cutting into half-frozen hunks of cattle carcass with no time to sharpen your knife when the blade dulls. Elvira explains to me how she recently has had to switch from her regular job to light duty because of muscular health problems. She holds up her arm, and I am appalled to see that it is literally twice the size of her other arm. I can tell just by looking at it how seized up the muscles are. A child comes running in, and Elvira gives the boy a caress on the head. And then she tells me how, because of her injury, she can't pick up her grandkids anymore, even the little ones. Well, there is factory work that hardens your body and toughens it, but also makes it hurt and binds it up, especially when you're 80 years old, like Big Yaya. And then there's factory work that distorts and disfigures your body. Work so painful that your sense of normal pain changes forever, and you can't sleep, as was generally the case for Elvira and most of her co-workers. Work that physically interferes with the ordinary gestures through which family members express love and care for each other. Now, to this point, I've focused on positioning alongside one another these stories of Mexican-American and Greek-American migration and labor. With Maria Martinez's words of caution still echoing in my ears, I'm suggesting that making such risky comparisons can help people, especially immigrant groups with European origins, begin to change how they think and feel about more recent migrants. People whose migration stories bring to light underappreciated forms of suffering that express delegitimized but very real fears, and that spotlight how a different kind and level of courage is required to withstand the fear and challenge the sources of suffering. So Maria was right, indeed, to insist on the disparities, and yet, by also noticing the things that are not entirely different, I think it becomes possible to tap into vital sources of curiosity and common feeling. And people might then be moved to ask why the distinctions are there and what we can do about them when they're not just differences, but also injustices that implicate us all because of both past and present circumstances. And when I say implicate us all, I'm thinking now about how to connect this cross-layering of Greek and Mexican immigration stories to the juxtaposition in my more strictly academic work between migrant workers' narratives and the stories that critical theory tells about power, domination, and social change. So far today, when I've discussed the agency of migrants, it's been mainly to reflect on the ability to muster the resources of bravery and resolve in the face of danger. I've also stressed the work that earlier European cohorts of immigrants like Greeks need to do to view their own migration stories with clearer eyes and a less romanticized affect. But a core theme of my research underscores the intellectual and political agential capacities of groups that bear the brunt of racist and capitalist oppression. And this, too, is vital for other communities with migration histories and all of us to grasp, if there is to be a shift in the U.S.'s trajectory toward ever more hostility against Mexican and other non-white migrants. Michel Foucault offers a compelling narrative about the growth of biopolitics in modern societies. Whereas disciplinary power, in Foucault's sense, applies itself to bodies through micro-techniques that produce normalized individual subjects, biopolitics seeks to foster the health and vitality of populations on aggregate levels and on average. It operates through programs of health and social hygiene, as well as through political and economic policies that channel flows of people, commodities, and capital in ways that are conducive to economic flourishing. And yet, for Foucault, modern social institutions do not try to optimize a state of life, as he puts it, for all populations equally. Biopolitics not only promotes life, but also unleashes racialized death on a mass scale. Killing populations designated as racially subordinate ensures a, quote, healthier and purer life for the racially privileged groups. And Foucault clarifies, when I say killing, I obviously do not mean simply murder as such, but also every form of indirect murder, the fact of exposing someone to death, increasing the risk of death for some people, or quite simply political death, expulsion, rejection. The stories of Elvira Mendez, Pedro Ruiz, and their fellow workers at Tyson suggest how such a biopolitical relation between Latino immigrant workers and the racially dominant population operates in America today. And these stories thus show low-status migrant workers exerting intellectual agency by naming the power relations they encounter in the critically energized vernacular of common sense. The workers thereby draw attention to features of contemporary biopolitics that actually don't appear in Foucault's account, although, of course, I too am acting here in splicing together these theoretical and popular narratives. First, the Tyson workers' narratives about how job-related injuries and health problems are baked into the meatpacking labor process. This points to the key role of occupational safety and health hazards in securing biopolitical domination, and that expands the locus of biopolitical power. Sorry, that was a little too fast. The locus of biopolitical power beyond Foucault's preferred site of the state into the realms of labor processes, labor markets, and corporate management. Along these lines, I would just mention that, the majority, I think all of the workers who were killed in the Baltimore Bridge collapse were migrant day laborers. And no thought was given to their own safety as they were out working in the middle of the night so that other people could drive across the bridge safely in the morning. Second, the American food system anchors this relation of racial domination and subordination, giving it what we might call a metabolic quality. Exposing workers like Pedro and Elvira to killing in Foucault's complex sense preserves the bodies and psyches of those with racial privilege from the perils of both the border and the slaughterhouse, and enables them to nourish themselves on the food that these immigrants manufacture. And then third, the workers' stories of crossing the border, evading detection in the U.S. interior, and being disfigured through their labor suggest how crucial implicitly racial discourses are to biopolitics today, notwithstanding the zombie revitalization of explicit biological racism courtesy of Trump and his defenders. Apparently racially neutral language is deployed to distinguish between legal and illegal immigrants, or between most jobs and the dangerous jobs staffed by immigrants because US-born Americans supposedly just won't do them. Or during the pandemic, between essential workers ordered to report to packing houses, hospitals, and warehouses, and others urged to work from home in relative physical safety. I think this underscores how important it is politically to contest these divisions as racially sorting mechanisms applied to the population and generating mass-level unequal exposure to racialized killing. On this broad social level, too, however, as with my juxtaposed Greek and Mexican immigration stories, a way out of political and cultural impasse can come from striving to hold together, albeit in friction, an awareness of these structural differences and an appreciation for some narrative confluences. And this is where we see the power of the more direct, self-conscious intellectual and political agency of the workers of Local 556. Now, when the people I interviewed discussed their frightening passages across the border and painful, emotionally crushing work at Tyson Foods, sometimes they spoke about these experiences in ways that made it seem like they were just at the mercy of blind fate. They said they felt ruled by forces utterly beyond their control, even their capacity to understand, powers to which they simply had no choice but to adapt to them. Gramsci helps us see how even articulating that fatalistic narrative actually exerts political agency by reinforcing the hegemonic status of the biopolitical status quo, grounding that status quo in a form of popular consent. And yet there was a competing strand, a strongly competing strand in the narratives, narrative strand in the interviews. These workers emphasized also their willingness and their abilities to stand up for themselves and withstand abusive treatment, in this way mustering what I would call counter-hegemonic agency. And you've already heard examples of this in the stories that I've relayed from Elvira and Pedro, and there were a lot more like that. They included narratives of brave determination on the migrant trail, and then these migration stories in turn flowed into anecdotes about dealing with the situation at Tyson. For example, bolstering each other's courage to seek medical help at work, despite the indifference and shaming and threats from supervisors that they got all the time. All these narrative currents then ultimately became tributaries that irrigated the union's unique public and political discourse. So the slogan of the workers' movement was, "Nosotros somos la unión." We are the union. And this expression encapsulated the workers' distinctive conception of democracy, which they called rank-and-file democracy, using the labor movement's parlance, but we could also call it participatory democracy. Elvira Mendez interpreted the slogan by explaining how she responded to inactive workers who complained that the union, and especially Maria Martinez as its head, that they just weren't doing enough to help the members. She said, they think that because Maria is the leader of the union, they think she is the union. But we all are the union, not Maria, not even the shop stewards, all the teams of workers. You always have to do your part if you want things to turn out right. This ethos of collective agency and shared responsibility defined the core of the political dimension of the workers' immigration and labor narratives. And the theoretical generativity of this approach lies in the fact that it wasn't only about the internal dynamics of this local union. Nosotros somos la unión also expressed a vision for collaborative, broad-based action to recognize and respond to the adverse consequences of the biopolitical apparatus for populations on both sides of the racial partition. Above all, the union sought to cultivate worker-consumer alliances, pointing to the problems that super high-speed production posed simultaneously for workers' physical safety and for the protection of consumers from being fed contaminated meat. The workers thereby sought to enlarge the sense of who they meant when they said, "We all are the union," to democratize that idea, in other words, in the sense of extending it over the people as a whole body, producers and consumers, the European and Latin American migrants, migrants and non-migrants in the US and abroad. That's a picture from Japan there, if you can see that on the right. I'm saying that the stakes of any effort to increase regard both for what's really different and what's similar between the experiences of today's migrant populations from the global south and earlier cohorts from Europe go well beyond the politics and cultural aspects of immigration per se. Suppose that Greeks and other migrant-descended Americans who harbor suspicions toward Mexicans or Latin Americans more generally were to heed my call to re-examine their own migrant histories more carefully, more humbly, more generously. This might not only help turn the tide against descendant Trumpian nativism, it could also help begin to transform the racial logics that underpin our wider systems for producing food, allocating jobs, making work safe and sustaining, and governing society democratically. It could feed efforts to meet the deficits of nutrition, health, and democracy with urgently needed resources of fellow feeling. Now, I know, it's an awful lot to ask of my fellow Greek Americans and any of you Greeks who are here from Greece to entertain the idea that Athens may not be the birthplace of all things essential to democracy. But in all seriousness, we do need to ask much of ourselves to foster a clear sense of how the things that are really different not only divide us, but also entangle our fates together. Thank you.
Paul, you said that this would be an experiment, and I'm very happy. I'm very happy that you embarked on this, because I think you thought-provokingly covered a lot of ground, and I also liked your radical focus on the experiences, the agency, and the narratives of the immigrants, because we all too often talk about immigration and about immigrants, but not with the immigrants, and I think that was really was opening up a lot of perspectives. So the floor is open for questions of all kinds. To our audience on YouTube, I want to remind you that you have the chance of asking questions through the Slido system, and you are all encouraged to do so. I can hardly see you for all the light, but I see somebody having raised his hands already, so why don't you go first?
Thank you for the presentation. I have one question, and it has to do with the longer history of organizing of Mexican and Latino workers. One thing that I've consistently seen in presentations like yours and books, articles, and what have you, is we focus on the organizing, but we don't focus on the collective bargaining. And I think that almost never actually happens. So when we take a union like the one that you studied, my question is, 10 years later, are they engaged in collective bargaining at that facility? And then another question, if I could just slip it in. When they stayed on the job, those workers, who were they pretending to be? I would argue they were pretending to be Mexican Americans, because there would have been Mexican American workers in Pasco in those facilities. And so the differences in the layers or imbrication of Latino community life would have been there for them to kind of say, well, you know, I'm at my job and I belong here, because there would have been people that looked like them and might have sounded like them that would have probably had U.S. citizenship or something like that. But the first question, I think, is probably more important because, you know, there's the story of the rise and fall of these unions, and then 10 years later, if you look them up, they don't exist anymore. And I wonder what happened to this union. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. I did mention that the union was actually busted by Tyson. The movement lasted for about 10 years. You know, by some measures, a long time. It wasn't just a flash in the pan, especially compared to other kind of copycat wildcat strikes that actually broke out at major meatpacking plants in Amarillo, Texas, and in Fort Morgan, Colorado, linked to, sort of as responses to the wildcat strike by these folks in Washington State. Much stronger movement there. But still, it was defeated by Tyson. On the order of collective bargaining, though, there's part of the story that I thought was really so interesting. Is it wasn't just about organizing, but it was actually about using official and sort of legalist processes of union, related to the business of unions and their interactions with the company, as organizing vehicles. So it was kind of a merging of organizing and collective bargaining, or an merging of organizing and lawsuits. There was a major lawsuit that actually went all the way to the Supreme Court and resulted in a 9-0 decision in favor of the workers, that these workers, by the Roberts Court, that these workers filed to get compensation, back pay, for the time that they were supposed to spend donning and doffing their protective equipment. So the meatpacking plants are so dangerous that workers have to wear what are essentially modern-day coats of chainmail to protect their bodies from getting slashed by coworkers, because they're working at high speeds in close quarters with slippery sort of circumstances. Those injuries happen all the time. But what the union did that was so brilliant was to use these, the sort of effort to increase the number of plaintiffs in the lawsuit as an organizing vehicle. So that's one example of how they merged these two processes. The other one was that when they were negotiating the new contract in 2004, they used that also as a way to organize the workers. And they surprised the company by having a large group of rank and file workers walk into the negotiating room when the company was just expecting lawyers to walk in. Instead, it was the members. And I was at some of the meetings where they sort of very patiently, exhaustingly, determined what the agenda would be for the contract. It really was an open and democratic process. It took a lot of time. It took a lot of effort. It was taxing for people. But I mean, they really did merge these two kinds of activities. The question about why the union was destroyed is a longer one. It has to do with political appointees at the National Labor Relations Board by the Bush administration, George W. Bush. It has to do with the hostility of a mostly white Teamsters International union leadership to migrant workers within the Teamsters. And it has to do with high turnover, because with these injury rates, you can just imagine how difficult it is to organize a union, because people aren't around long enough to acquire a sense of belonging to a union culture that's based at that workplace.
Okay, Carmen Birkle is here in the first. And so if you raise your hand, please wave. You're very hard to see from here.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk, and I think there's a lot that combines both of our talks. And there's one thing I was thinking about while you were telling us the story of your own grandparents' immigrant experience, because that part of your talk sounded a lot like some of the autobiographical narratives that I will be talking about tomorrow. And I was wondering if you have ever thought about the way in which you tell your own story, because you talk about you being a child, but in part you know this from your grandparents, in part you may have known this from your own experience. So it is at first mediated by your grandparents, and then you're telling us the story here again, which is again a remediation, if you want, of your own story. And there, of course, the questions of memory and how far that can be, how should I say, understood realistically, the use of photographs that you showed us, the juxtaposition of your grandfather as a young boy and then all of a sudden as a grown-up physician, I think you said, and so on. The whole life history of your grandfather was in these two images, basically. So I'm wondering if you ever thought about how you narrativize your own immigrant background.
Yeah, I'm really at the start. This is literally the second time that I've done this talk before an audience. So, yeah, I think I should think more about that. I mean, I was thinking about this also, not just the way that I narrate my own family's experiences, but also when I'm reporting the stories that were told to me in the oral history interviews by workers. I was recalling Karen's words yesterday of caution about the ways that these stories are malleable, and there are things that are, memories are sometimes invented. And I don't know if Pedro Ruiz was as courageous all the time as he said that he was, but I'd be curious to know, what kinds of things I should be thinking about when I'm narrating my own. Do you mean possibly being more explicit about those levels of mediation and the possibility for slippages or reinventions with each phase? I see you nodding your head, so yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, but it's been very exciting to do this, and thanks for coming along in this ride.
But it's also interesting to look at which parts of the story are not malleable. So which parts of the story cannot be just simply told in a different way? You know what? So those are an important. This is also an important question to ask, right?
Yeah, I think it has to do with the. It kind of gets to a bit like Karen's point about the importance of the local yesterday, because what my immediate thought is the sort of physically direct parts of those experiences. Like, I don't think I'm really giving a fairly unmediated sense, I think, of what it felt like to touch my great-grandmother's back and what those muscles were like, or, the sort of sensual palpability of the limes on the table and the lemons on the table. Yeah.
There was one question in the very back.
Thank you. Thank you for connecting the history of labor and the history of immigration so well for us. I was curious to hear you talk about the future of work. Like, what happens when unskilled labor is replaced big scale by machines? What happens when that narrative drops out? How would you use maybe or adapt or update Foucault's biopolitics theory that you mapped for us in that sense? And how can we use histories of labor and histories of immigration for forging solidarity when unskilled labor is being replaced?
Well, thanks for asking the question, because it gives me a chance to talk for a minute about my current research. Actually, so this book that I'm writing about night work and the politics of freedom, it involves empirical investigations with new communities of workers that I hadn't really engaged with much before. And what I'm finding through this work, so the sort of occupations that are at the top of the list are, on the one hand, warehouse labor in logistics warehouses, like the Amazon warehouses, especially in Southern California, but obviously all over the world. And also micro work, which is sometimes also called click work or crowd work, but basically it's very, very informal work that people do by getting on online platforms and just doing these microscopic tasks and being paid a few cents for each click. That's why it's sometimes called click work. And one thing that's oddly in common between people who work in the warehouses at Amazon and micro workers is this, what I'm calling a kind of extreme detachment from the job, or job dissociation, in the sense that they're not really even working, but there are all these ways that people are just kind of removing themselves from the laboring process. And micro work is really important to think about with all the discourse about AI and job replacement, because in fact, AI systems require a huge understructure, I'm not quite sure how it's substructure, of human labor to educate the machines. And accounts of AI sometimes gloss over that and say that, you know, AI systems are making use of Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is one of those platforms to do the micro work. But that's you know, hours and hours and hours of human labor that's going into enabling these machines to work. So it's not entirely, I think the story about machines replacing humans is too simple there. And I'm really interested in not just the absence of work, but this changing orientation to work, where people just don't seem to see it as a job in any way. So for example, we did surveys and interviews with UK micro workers and found that for most of the people whom we spoke with, they saw micro work as something that was more like scrolling through apps on their phone, like YouTube or TikTok. When they got bored of TikTok, they did micro work. But they also did micro work at all these times a day when you would think that they might be catching a little rest for themselves, like when they couldn't sleep, or when the baby took a nap, or while they were watching sport on television, or while they were cooking, or while they were in transit to go to a job. And so there's this way that I think the new laboring economy is sort of injecting work into more and more spaces and times of everyday life in a way that's very pernicious. You asked about the sort of organizing consequences there. What I think I'm arguing in this new project is that it depends, organizing working people in the future is going to depend more and more on just not organizing around work and workplaces. So there's some people, for example, who I'm in touch with who think that to get Amazon workers organized, you have to focus on the labor process and the kinds of mistreatment and occupational safety and health hazards that warehouse workers very commonly experience. But I'm arguing, yes, that's important, but even more important is to get people thinking more about the ways that work is eroding resources, capabilities, and relationships that enrich our everyday lives outside of work. So what Marxist feminist theorists call social reproduction, I think that's the key field of intervention for labor organizing in the future.
Okay, we put a lot of money, effort, and technology into offering this conference also in a hybrid version. I'm very happy to report that we have a question on Slido, which is a first. So I will privilege this question now. Could you please tell in more detail about demographics and origin of the workers of the union you spoke about?
Sure. So the workers, so I was talking about this local union. It was Teamsters Local 556 of Eastern Washington and Northeastern Oregon. The union no longer exists again. It was abolished in 2005. But while it existed, the main group of workers who were represented by the union were the employees, these 1,500 roughly workers at this big Tyson Foods meat producing factory. There were also several hundred workers apiece at a couple of frozen food manufacturers in that region, and some UPS drivers, for some reason, were part of the union as well. About 90% of the workers were Mexican immigrants. Very few, very, very few were Mexican Americans, as in the sense of being US-born Mexican origin people. And there really was hardly any Latino diversity, very much in contrast to the population that I worked with when I did my subsequent project with day laborers in Seattle and Portland, where people were from not only all over Mexico, but also from all over Central America, and then sometimes from other countries as well, from the Middle East or from Eastern Europe or South America. I don't know exactly when Teamsters Local 556 was founded, come to think of it, but it had existed for a long time as a very passive sort of company collaborative union. The main union office was in Walla Walla, which was very far from where all the workers lived, not that far, 30 miles from Pasco. That was it, right?
It's already vanished. So obviously, once you read this out, then it vanishes.
Wow.
The question. But this gives me time to somehow ask one of the questions that I have, and that's really regarding the current role of unions in the immigration debate. I mean, historically, we know that the unions were, at least some of the unions, were all for immigration restriction, that somehow the anti-immigration league had one of its main carriers, the unions. So what is the current role of unions and the current take of the unions in the immigration debate?
Yeah, you know, a lot of people don't know that the United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez himself were anti-migrant until the early 1970s because they were mainly representing U.S.-born workers and Filipino workers, you know, Mexican origin workers and Filipino workers in the fields, and they saw immigrant workers, undocumented people, as a threat to their interests. But they changed their politics when it became clear that the anti-immigrant politics that was growing in the late 60s and early 70s was really racial politics, and it was directed at all Mexicans and Mexican origin people. But in terms of unions, I mean, so the problem with unions today, as most people probably are aware, is that the membership in the United States has gotten so small. You know, well under 10%, I think probably under 5% I'm not sure what the exact figures are, so I shouldn't say, but definitely under 10% in the private sector and diminishing in the public sector as well. That's why I got really interested in worker centers, or what are called alt-labor organizations, or alternative labor organizations, for the project that he did with day laborers. And these worker centers are just really, really fascinating because they're more, I mean, I think that they're a better response to precarious work in many ways than traditional unions, because for one thing, they're place-based. And so it's grounded at a certain communal location, like an actual building, or at least a, you know, a portable, you know, unit in a city neighborhood for workers who get sent out to do very individualized jobs or just small teams of workers throughout an urban area. Women doing house cleaning, for example, all over the Seattle area, including out in the suburbs, or men who do these yard work jobs or construction all over Seattle or Portland. In that kind of, it's kind of a reversal of the scenario that Marx and Engels theorized in the Communist Manifesto, where the whole idea was that because workers were all concentrated in this one place on the factory floor, revolution would, you know, explode out of that scene. Not when workers are dispersed so widely, and when there is no one workplace from day to day.
Great. Kathleen Schmidt. Oh, was there another question in the back? But I have Kathleen Schmidt first on my list, and then we hand over to.
Okay. Thank you so much. Just in addition, those worker centers, they offer classes for English as a second language. They offer skills training classes and so on. Some unions do that too, but maybe also unions kind of lost or did not really pay respect to that opportunity. My question was slightly different. You used the term resonance and relation a lot, especially after Maria, I believe it was, had told you, oh no, it's not the same. You know, your immigration stories is not the same as ours, but maybe the key may lie in the concept of resonance or relation, that you create a certain affect in people so that they can relate to things. And in that respect, I wanted your views on other ideas of making relation possible. And I thought of memorials, memorializing, and I thought about this for a reason. Just recently, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire Memorial was inaugurated in New York City. And it was very, very simple. You had just two, well, it's not done yet, but what's supposed to be like, it's like two metal panes reached from the 8th floor where the women had to jump because when the fire broke out, the exits were locked. And so everyone will just see at that NYU building in the middle of Lower Manhattan, will just see these huge metal panes of all the way that the women had to jump, mostly immigrant women, into their death. And that seemed to be a much more effective way of creating affect and resonance and yeah, maybe relation too. And I was wondering whether you came across any initiatives or experiences in your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. No, I think to me that seems a very promising idea. This idea of memorial and memorializing. I know that the day labor centers do these kinds of things. They do it especially around the Day of the Dead for Mexican, in sort of traditional Mexican folks, and people set up these kinds of family altars in the worker center. And a lot of the workers are homeless, so it's like they don't have a living room where they could put that kind of thing up. But even though those worker centers are community centers too, they're not just like union offices, they're open to the whole community, whether people are day laborers or what have you. And there are volunteers who are not Latino often, who are coming in and teaching the classes, or participating in social events. Still, that's not like out there in public the way you're describing with the Triangle Factory Memorial. That really blows my mind to hear that. That sounds amazing. I just think it requires more thought, and I appreciate the idea.
Okay, I have no more people on my list, so I suggest that we hand over to this one lad. Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to turn away from this important labor conversation to go to your call of bridging immigration history and contemporary migration labor. I'm a historian of Finnish migration to North America, but I work at the Migration Institute of Finland, where our primary focus is researching and advocating on migration issues into Finland today. And so we do a lot of work in trying to bridge the histories of Finns as migrants to the conditions and the lives of people who are now coming to Finland as migrants. So exhibits, podcasts, interviews, publications, whatever we can think of. But it doesn't feel to be very effective. There are so many walls against that, and the discourses that keep coming about, yeah, well, blah, blah, we had it this hard, and they're just, because the kind of misinformation and how extremely polarized the discourses are, certainly in the US, but increasingly so in Finland as well, and elsewhere. And it can feel quite disheartening, I think. So I just wondered, how's it going? You're convincing people that they should be more empathetic towards current migrants.
I don't know. I mean, I came up with this. The first time I developed this version of this talk, I was actually invited by that civic organization in Philadelphia that my grandparents founded in 1936, the Hellenic University Club, to give a talk. So it seemed a good place to do that. And I mean, a lot of people in that community, in the Philadelphia Greek-American community, are Republicans. I know some of my mother's old friends are Trump supporters. And I couldn't really tell. Well, for one thing, it had to be on Zoom because of the timing of it. But so I couldn't really tell if people were persuaded by it. And it seems like on the one hand, it could be a drop in the ocean. On the other hand, it felt good to challenge people in that kind of way. And I think maybe I don't know what the characteristics have been of the efforts that you've made in Finland so far, but what the previous individual was saying about relying especially on new kinds of affective experiences, I don't know how much that's been part of the work that you all have done, but it strikes me that when there's misinformation about what the facts are and who the people are, and there's a problem is cognitive about understanding, that getting to people's feelings and having more kinds of embodied experiences and exposures to different kinds of people in different ways. It's not like that's a fail-safe recipe, but it just intuitively it seems to me that that's part of what helps.
Okay, we are at the end of the second day of our conference. This was exhausting, if not exhaustive to all of us. You were the only one between us and dinner, but I didn't think about this while I was listening to you. So thank you very much for this thought-stimulating second keynote. Thanks for being with us here in Munich. You will be around tomorrow, so we have time to ask you further questions. And with this, I close the second day of the conference, but not without thanking our keynoter once again. So thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you.